Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this is our 602 episode. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Eric, Professor David Smith, and my friend Mr. Philippi. So first, I would like to give chance, Professor Eric. You know that metaverse is a very like interesting topic right now, even in Malaysia and Asia Pacific. Many corporation, many startup, they are working on metaverse. So we have our expert panelists, and the expert panelists actually give us a lot of industrial insight, which will help us to grow our startup. First, I request Professor Eric.
Well, the metaverse really isn't that different from anything else. It's just technology getting faster and faster and faster. And every time technology moves, trust moves with it. So, most of the laws that we're dealing with in the US come actually way back, a lot of them from mail fraud. When people, how do you trust a letter? And then after that, it was, how do you trust a phone call? Then it was, well, how do you trust email? And I know if you're like me, you probably get several of those emails every day, even screened out less, promising you millions of dollars, something like that. So the real key as we go global and go into the developing worlds is who trusts who and how do you trust? And there's two levels of trust. There's systematic trust, where trust is actually built into the system, like when you get a bank transferring money, that's pretty clear. Of the bank, is the money there? Can you do it? Do you have let's move it? So there's that kind of trust. The other kind of trust comes from getting to know people and building reputations. Well, the problem is, does your reputation follow you, and for what? Like, there's politicians that are very clear, and when they make promises in this, but in their personal lives, what they promise, or the other way around, their personal lives are rock solid. As soon as you put government on them, you don't know what they're going to do. So there's this idea of how do you track trust with somebody. Sometimes they call that respect. And so a lot of times we do our court system, there's kind of a promise. And then when the promise is broken, then we say, oh, what do we do about it? In the metaverse, that's really tough because we don't know what we're promising. A lot of times it's unclear as we're trying to define what the metaverse is. So when you try and put that enforcing trust by having consequence, that is a tough thing. So a lot of times in the metaverse, we do that with smart contracts and proof of work and trustless systems. So I guess that's my main point to start, is this isn't any different than any other system. When you come up with something new, the first thing you go is, how do you trust that? People are generally pretty trusting, and then people take advantage of that. And then you say, oh, how do we enforce trust? But I know when we were doing contracts in certain Asia countries, um, sometimes those contracts meant very little, but the relationship you had was critical. They would not violate and look bad among their friends, but they felt nothing of saying, yeah, we made you this deal, we signed this contract to deliver so many. One time it was fishing reels. So many fishing reels at this price, but we've decided if you want it, we've just upped the price. You've already given us some money, we've just upped the price. They felt nothing of doing that based on a contract. But as soon as that person said, oh, really? Your friends are going to know you did that? Ooh, well, no, we don't cheat friends. So, so, tr- so you have to figure out how to do trust anytime anything new comes.
Thank you, Professor Eric. Now I request Professor David Smith. What do you mean by the role of trust in metaverse? How we can create more trust and more opportunity for the youth community?
Well, remember the term metaverse is a very broad thing, and it really refers to the virtual world where people can access it over the internet. So it goes back to the early days of role-playing games and everything like that, where trust was a moving target and really one that you had challenges with. And what is interesting with the metaverse is, it's built up on 3D virtual environments with VR, AR, smartphones, computers, game consoles, but built around avatars and multiple identities. And these multiple identities can visit locations both real and imaginary. But here's the interesting thing: they buy and sell goods. They trade services, and it's built upon technology such as blockchain, cryptocurrency, NFTs, and really it pushes the Web 3.0 further because you're decentralizing more of the internet. And once you do that, the area of trust becomes very, very important. And you begin to see that the value chains are different. And kind of like Eric was talking about there, you you go and you have to deal with realities that interact with the real world, but in a virtual arena, and do the laws of the real world apply in metaverse? Do the regulations of them in each country, how do they apply when the metaverse is this virtual global entity? And how do you interpret those? One of the movements is towards the metaverse is we're going to have to protect the IP, intellectual property. Now, what nation IP laws apply to the intellectual property you put in the metaverse? Um, Eric mentioned contracts, and I agree. In some places I've done work in the past, a signed contract's just one negotiating point, and it continues to evolve. But that is going to be how the metaverse is too, in that, where's the jurisdictions for these contracts? Where are they enforced? Can I, in the virtual metaverse, can I move my jurisdiction from the United States one day? Can I move it to the Bahamas the next day? Can I move it to Crete the next day? Can I come to Malaysia there? And can I do that? And Sharif, you're bringing up a couple of my graphics. This is one as you look at the layers of the metaverse, and trust, you can see, starts at all of them. The infrastructure is using all the latest technologies, 5G, Wi-Fi 6, a lot of the GPU-based technologies. But then you have to go to the human interface, and that's where we're seeing the smart glasses, wearables, voice, neural implants, and others beginning to go forward. But at the next core, it's a very decentralized service where it has edge compute, a lot of artificial intelligence, a lot of microservices and containerized services, particularly at the edge of the cloud that you're interacting with in blockchain. The spatial computing is real interesting because as the metaverse is being developed, part of the spatial environment still has not been well defined by standards. And whose standards are going to do it? But how do you create that economy? How do you work that commerce? Then, how do I discover it? Is it ratings? Is it stories? Is it references from friends? What is going to be the metaverse ad networks? In the early experiments we see now, as we're building these various metaverses, both from private companies and some governments, we haven't seen that discovery side really go. How easily can I take my a avatar and cross all of these different metaverses? And finally, you have the experience, and hopefully the experience will become more encompassing as it continues to go. It's kind of like the virtual immersion caves I've been in the past. I would almost like to see my metaverse be something that I can physically walk through. And as I turn to my left, the images change. As I turn to the right, as I look up. And these are much like some of the projects I worked in, 25 years ago, with some of the big oil companies, where we built these immersion caves to walk through potential oil deposits underneath the ocean and underneath the ground. That is kind of what the metaverse is supposed to be as we look forward to it. The other thing, though, is the metaverse is really built up of all these different elements. where you have your digital access, the gaming. The metaverse is supposed to be device independent, but many of them that are out there are not. But you can see the marketplace, the digital commerce, the events, and digital humans. Digital humans are going to be a big part of it. We've talked a lot on your show, Sharif, over the past about digital twins. Well, as we begin to more and more of our digital humans in the metaverse, how many are you going to have? You know, I might have a avatar where I'm a leader of a company. I might have an avatar where, like some of our other guests on your show, I want to go dancing every night, but as a different avatar. I might have an avatar of me on the beach where I can go in distress and get away from the anxiety because the beach is where that does it for me. Now, which one of those identities is mine? Which one do you trust? Which one do you not trust? Oh, I might want to become a gangster in one of my avatars. Do the roles of trust and metaverse have to take each of those avatars and treat it differently? And how we're going to do that. And there's a lot of ways we can look at trust. But if you look at the number of places where identity trust has been breached, uh, of all the type of cyber crimes, 61% of them are because your identity was breached. So if 61% of cyber crimes identity breaching, and I bring it into this new virtual world of the metaverse, that percentage is going to go up in the metaverse. And you begin to see it, particularly when I look at what am I going to do with events? How am I going to shop? What am I going to do in my workplace? What am I going to do for digital commerce, digital currency, and NFTs? All of those have to be built upon the road of trust. And that's still being defined very much in the metaverse. And that might be the place for me to leave this at this point and let some of the other people begin to talk some about it.
Thank you, sir. Should I remove this?
I did.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Philippi, you know that World Talent Economy Forum, we are actually launching one of the largest conference in Asia Pacific, especially we launch it in uh, India. It's a Nikola Tesla Technology conference. I just want to share some informations about this conference. Just a moment, just give me 30 seconds. Okay.
You're muted.
So we are working with the Nikola Tesla Technology Conference. My question is that, like, how this metaverse can be helpful for our conference, because we want to engage with more people in Asia Pacific, especially in the developing nations in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So, what is your advice?
Yeah, we've one of the biggest things we've seen about getting together uh, in person or virtually with these conferences, um, to tie it back to the conversation of trust. It's interesting now with these digital technologies that you can really connect with the people that are coming to the conference in person and virtually by utilizing some of the tools we've been using in the metaverse around gaming. And as it was discussed, some of this technology is on blockchain and able to have a trust system that's distributed in the background to give out things like participation tokens or participation NFTs. And it sounds like a simple, it sounds simple. You usually get a ticket to participate in an event, But this would be a good way for them to get onboarded, to go through the process of getting a digital ticket. And why that's important, it makes everyone feel almost like a VIP. It allows you to connect directly to those people. And David was talking about, how do we know, how do we trust if you're the real person? You can have multiple avatars. This could be the first ticket to kind of build some trust that that was you that participated in the event. So I've seen a lot of crypto events or metaverse events that now we're holding our tickets in our phone, in our wallet. So almost like that concert you were very excited to go to back. We're a little bit older. I'm sure we all real had that little paper ticket that we put on the wall, and look, we went to that concert. Well, now you have something that can last forever that says, hey, I went to this event, and it gives you a direct connection to all those people that maybe you reward them. Maybe it's a nice way to keep in contact with them, give them a discount for the next event, introduce them to some other online forums. But it does build that trust. It might be a gateway into some of these more uh, digital forums, digital metaverses. Um, One interesting aspect we've participated in conferences was a very open dialogue where there was no agenda, and we wanted to have it all around governance and something called a DAC, a distributed autonomous community. And it was a virtual conference. Everyone got together, and the purpose was to everyone have equity in this new digital company or corporation that we started by getting a token of this new company. And it was a very different forum. Usually it's a top-down approach for a conference. There's one person speaking, everyone else listening. So we made it a little bit more interactive, and without any agenda, ask people, what are your values? How would we, with a group of people that have never met before, can we accomplish coming up with a constitution and some rules that we can all trust each other going forward to try and build something? And we use these digital tools to all give us equity in this new conference that we started. And we called it a DACathon. But there are ways to accomplish two things: deliver your message, make your stakeholders happy for your conference, and also the first step of maybe getting some of the attendees and speakers into maybe a more digital form through digital tickets and a gateway into maybe the first step into a metaverse. So just some thinkings to tie the conference into digital, blockchain, and metaverse. So just some of my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have about my new friends in our show. So what the interesting things you want to share with our audience about this metaverse? And if you introduce yourself, that will be good for our audience.
I think
Hello.
that's you, Extra.
It's you, Extra. You need to unmute.
Can you unmute, please?
That'll make things. Sorry, that'll make things easier for everybody. Um, I'm sorry. You just wanted me to introduce myself.
And put in your inputs. What do you think? We're talking about trust, metaverse, conferences, digital. I know you have talked about trust by linking, for example, NFTs with and crypto with things that are real. So you've got some definite insights into trust.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely speak to that. I mean, I speak to conferences too, but probably trust would be, maybe I'm a little more on point than, kind of my experience of metaverse conferences, which may not be all that positive, just in general. But yes, sir. To your point. So anyway, so just to introduce myself, my name's Extra. I run a company called W2, and we connect, like Eric said, physical assets to digital assets and so forth. So inherent in that is a lot of focus on trust and transparency, because I think that that's certainly missing from definitely the world of crypto, maybe more so than the world of metaverses, depending on how you parse those two differences. So we wanted to put in, a series of internal controls and so forth with our business that helps kind of build that trust with our token holders. And I think that's definitely something that's missing, kind of generally, is how do you create somewhat of a trustful structure in what's inherently somewhat of a trustless environment, right? Of crypto. So the controls that we put in place, like the auditing for the physical assets and the transparency around all the transactions being all chain, and even the audits that we do being on chain, are just some of the mechanisms, like I said, that we kind of utilize to create that trust. So it's somewhat unique to the way our business works, is to provide that trust. And certainly when it comes to hard assets like we use, like precious metals and so forth, like our business does, instead of fiat tokens, like I would describe a lot of the other cryptos are, it does become a little more acute in terms of what exactly the token holder expects to see in a trust based kind of ecosystem, if you will, right? And so, to the point about the the asset backed NFTs that we've done, that certainly is trying to fill in that gap of where NFTs have inherently that risk of going to zero and so forth, and the risk does. I mean, excuse me, the trust doesn't inherently exist in any kind of tangible form, and I think that's part of the reason of why you don't see necessarily adoption of NFTs, even within the crypto world, being somewhat universal, and certainly not in the mass adoption way of NFTs, because of that lack of trust, if you will.
So, Extra, are you saying that if I want to link an NFT with property or gold or silver, one of the ways you do that is through independent audits? And if so, how do I know to trust the audit?
Right. I'm saying that the audit is one of the control points that we have for, specifically in our use case, to help build that trust, right? And I think that that's part of the reason of why you don't see other precious metals or other hard asset backed cryptos being really adopted, because of that lack of trust. Now, specific to your question about how do you trust the auditor, I mean, there's always going to be that question, right, of counterparty risk, essentially. So you can't eliminate that, and we acknowledge that. And I think that it would be foolish to say that you can create a structure on a digital, especially in somewhat of a decentralized nature, that is always going to be able to eliminate that risk, right? I think it's more about what things can you put in place to mitigate that risk as much as possible, right? And even when you see certain stable coins, dollar-backed tokens, their success has not been inhibited by their inherent lack of transparency, because I think that there aren't other good options. For example, right? I think if you look, I mean, certainly Luna, has illustrated that in the most recent example. But even if you look at Tether and so forth, they have, I mean, specifically Tether hasn't been, like I said, inhibited in growth in terms of scaling to a huge market cap without, well, not necessarily doing best practices in terms of creating that trust, if you will, right? But like I said, I think that's largely due to the fact that there isn't a whole lot of better options to that. Where I think in a perfect world, you wouldn't have seen Tether have been so successful, and not that I have any problem with their business model. And like I said, in a perfect world, I think, or in a trust-focused world, let's put it that way, I don't think you would have seen Tether, for example, become as successful as it did because of that kind of inherent lack of control that they have.
So you brought up a real important, which is the real-time monitoring or the flow of information. People feel more trustful when you can see things happening and there's some insight into it. So I guess I would ask David that question about, how the role of real-time monitoring in terms of developing trust. For example, you can go to Olive Land and you can buy part of this eco-agricultural project, and you can buy it by square foot, but most of that is automated, and you can see the cameras and the status of the farming occurring. Could they generate that artificially? I don't know. David, what are your thoughts on the role of real-time monitoring or information flows?
Well, your example was a great one. And one of the metaverse companies I follow, PEX, is trying to do that right now with selling land. And to me, once I try to sell a virtual piece of land in a virtual environment to virtual avatars in a environment without a regulatory environment to support it, it's virtually impossible to understand how the trust is there in this virtual land. So to me, virtuals, that's kind of where it is. But the real-time nature, I think you're really onto something there. Because one of the huge challenges we're seeing in the early parts of the metaverse is not only bullying in the metaverse, but harassment of all different types. And, that's part of the role of trust too, is how to prevent the harassment, how to prevent the bullying. And even though what we see in Meta and others trying to do it in our 2D space is not working very well, but it's going to become even harder in the 3D space. So we are going to have to put in place some better real-time tools for things like how to handle this harassment. And, understanding that the harassment disproportionately targets minorities and is very different country to country. And the rules are very different country to country. So it goes back to the jurisdiction thing, the trust we talked about earlier, and how to do that. Some of it might be we need to put biometrics into the metaverse and have these biometrics follow us is part of how to establish the trust there. Do we need to do other types of tracking in real time to see it? When I take your question, Eric, and of real-time monitoring and pull it over into the economics of the metaverse, I say definitely. We've seen how many cryptocurrencies go under in the last 60 days, a lot. With a lot of that, both soft currency and hard currency being lost. And how do we do that? And how can we put that in place? The other interesting real-time thing on this, Eric, is some of the proposals as we look across the groups trying to get into this is the regulatory role of establishing trust might be directly proportional to the amount of infrastructure that's provided by the countries. And I find that is a very interesting proposition in this virtual metaverse, because you begin to look at it and you see that culture, laws, uh, even how you socialize, how you view other people within your community varies so much by nation to nation. And the metaverse kind of wants to make that flat. And so, how do you begin to get those nuances in real time monitoring that can be customized for your unique country, for your unique culture, for your unique infrastructure? Might be a way to do that. We know on some of the programs with Sharif here that one of our speakers who is in Jordan not occasionally has internet problems. He has internet problems 100% of the time. So if I'm trying in a country like Jordan to implement a metaverse with how to put the regulatory things in place, how to do trust in a nation like that where internet is spotty, can I even use the same rules as I do, say, in a Japan or the United States or in Norway, where my internet's a lot better? And how can we do that with this whole infrastructure and the inequities and how to make the metaverse more equitable between all the players? The basis for that is rooted in trust. And
And
so that's an important part, not just at the commercial side, but the regulatory side. And at the area of the whole cyberbullying and harassment in the metaverse, I think that's just going to get worse than we've had it before. So we've
yeah,
got to work the trust on those elements as well.
and it can be even better because you can tag people. I could give you an NFT tagging you as something like your political or how you feel about the war in Ukraine, and we can tag it and find it.
Right.
So, part of the problem with transparency opening is the fact that transparency is open and people can do things with that. I guess I would ask, kind of finishing this frame since we lost Sharif for just a moment there, is Dwayne does a lot of work with promoting the tools that are discovered in gaming. One of those, which is Alien Worlds, which has I don't know, 200,000, 300,000 people doing transactions. That's a lot of transactions. But what's different about that is they're opening up those transactions to people who want to do things. The plan is that you could go in and say, well, I want to do this. I mean, and imagine that if you're trying to do business and Home Depot or Amazon was opening up all their data, imagine what you could do. And that's what they're talking about doing, is opening up the infrastructure. That's kind of what you were talking about, data, that infrastructure, and open that up to governance. I guess I would ask Dwayne, what are your lessons learned or thoughts on what happens when you open up the inner workings of these organizations? What does that do for and against trust?
Yeah, since it's built on blockchain, um, I guess the first level of trust there is historically a community and a large group of players and gamers would spend their hard-earned money and their valuable time building up their character, building up their tool set, building up their respect and their points to start feeling like they've gone up the leaderboard in these games. And these games are obviously built to be interactive and draw people in. The risk there, though, historically, was that game was centralized, that if that game ever decided to stop or leave, all of your assets were gone. All of your hard work was gone. So just at the starting point of building this on an open source, transparent layer means that the risk of a centralized entity going down is reduced because you're on a distributed network that is more resilient than a centralized database. So we've seen in the past of all these centralized database, the biggest, most wealthiest companies on earth can't seem to keep our information private anyways. So, we're trusting these centralized bodies with very private information, my credit card, my birth date. So moving as base level to a distributed system, I'm putting the onus and the responsibility of, to the individual to log on. And there's a little bit, a little bit more openness there that with, Eric and both Extra, we're talking about smart contracts in Extra's business, how he does smart contracts. There's almost a resiliency that as a consumer or a player, that if these companies that are built on a blockchain, that company could leave and the game mechanics, or in Extra's case, his silver-backed tokens can still work. So it kind of eliminates a single point of failure. Now, on the point of having everything transparent and open, the good points, obviously, is that it builds community and it builds this value chain where now I can contribute to this open source code. I can grab the data like anybody else can and use it to create value. And there's that split on understanding that everything is transparent, but it does enable a community to quickly come together and create more value than we can individually. And it does protect my assets, where instead of that centralized game owning all those, game pieces or all my points or all my, internet money, now I have ownership of that. So quite a change to, enable a community to feel empowered when, I actually have those assets. And if I see that that community, that open source game might be going in a direction that I'm not comfortable with, I can take all of their code, and it's called a fork, which means that I just copy it, paste it over here, and I can change the whole direction of my community. And if I decide that I want to do what they did, but a little bit different, because of that transparency and openness, I can move direction and bring my community with me. The other nice thing about transparency, we're talking about bad actors or harassment, is I can start layering in conditions of how you have to behave in my community. And instead of pushing the control to regulators or third parties that aren't in my community every day, you know what I mean? They might not have a grasp of what we're trying to accomplish or who the players or the community is. We can now have a little bit of self-control where we're able to kick people out. And I think it's one of the more important things about these communities is very easy to get in, but we all have to establish some rules of the game, some guidelines, a constitution, some sort of governance at the end of the day. And we can self-police and control these communities. And Eric was saying you could have an NFT that kind of discloses my beliefs or my political positions. Well, on the other side, you can also have an NFT that shows that you've been a good participant, that you've helped out, that you have built this respect and responsibility. And instead of penalizing people, you could build respect by holding those type of tokens and NFTs. So there is a two-way street there. There is a balance of understanding that this is open and transparent, but in a community, we can use that to our advantage to share what the community views as respect and value. And building that on a blockchain that's not centralized, there will be centralized metaverses like Facebook, where you don't own your data, you don't own your NFT, and you know that if it's free, they're making money off all your data and you're just a user. And I think the base level of just coming to a blockchain builds a little bit of redundancy and allows us to have a little bit more choice in where we see these communities growing and going.
If I could add to that real quick. So, Dwayne, while I don't necessarily disagree, I think that you're still in that community structure you're describing. I don't necessarily. I guess my point would be I don't think it's trust is inherent in having that community, right? That community can be co-opted. That community can be manipulated and so forth, right? So, the community of its in of itself, I don't think necessarily builds trust. In a way that we've seen, especially in crypto, be manipulated in so many different ways, right? Because I think there's always in that community that you're describing, there's always going to be somewhat of a hierarchy, right? Of who do I trust in that community, right? More than who I don't trust, right? Like Dwayne, you and I know each other very well. We hung out in person and so forth, right? So, I may in that community structure you're describing may rely on you, not knowing all the details, for example, right? Because I may not know what all those control points are, right? That build up that trust, right? And I don't think necessarily, for example, like going to the real time use case that we were describing a second ago, right? In olives or what the example that Eric was using a minute ago. There, like just for my own business, there has been other people who have tried to use security camera footage and other sort of real time, quote unquote, data input in order to secure their assets, right? The back of the token. Well, those have turned out to be largely ineffectual because they're so easily they're manipulable, put it that way, and B, they don't necessarily tell you what's going on, right? So I know Eric asked me about how do you trust the auditors and so forth in my business use case, right? But and again, there is an inherent risk there. The same way that being able to see the cameras and see who's going in on the vault doesn't exactly explain the entire process either, right? Because there are going to be legitimate uses. The same way that in your community example, there's going to be legitimate people who need to interact, right, with the tokens and with the system and so forth, right? The same way that seeing a video camera or a CC of somebody moving things and assets around doesn't necessarily mean they're doing something nefarious, right? And in most instances, if you're accepting their functionality, then you're not going to be able to notice something that's different or something that's nefarious versus just a regular operation of the business. And I guess the last point that I want to make real quick is when I was working in banking, for part of my time I was an internal auditor, and we used to have this saying that the illusion of an internal control is worse than an internal control, because if you trust something that's there because you think it's there, is actually worse than not having it there. Because if you know it's not there, you know to look into it again and question it and test it again, because you know the control doesn't exist. Whereas if you have the illusion that control exists, then there is somewhat the illusion of trust in this example, right? Of, oh, I don't need to look into that because we have this control in place. And I think that's where it kind of goes back to Dwayne, your point about community, right? If you're just testing that illusion of a control because of their communities involved, you're probably better off not having the community and at least you know that the control doesn't exist. If you understand my point, Wayne.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent point, and thank you for today's discussion. I have to go for the concluding remarks for today's session. First, I request Professor Eric.
Well, I'd like to bring Virginia's point about technology. Technology is just something you use, and you use what you have. So a lot of the things that we do and deal with the metaverse are very slow. I mean, we can use text messaging, we can use email. So there's nothing preventing it. The idea is you go with what you have. If you don't have 3D, and it's even possible to bridge 3D users with text users, with email users. So it's really, you don't start with the technology, start with what you want to do, start with what you have, and work for there, and then bridge where you can to get high technology users with low technology users. So it's completely possible. Virginia, also about data security. Well, data security is just a matter of cost. You can absolutely make things very secure. And the more secure you make it, the more it costs. I mean, sometimes a little bit of security, like the difference between 95% secure and 98%, is a huge difference cost-wise, especially if you get up there. But I used to do government stuff, and they were like, "Oh, everything needs to be secure." And you're really going to protect that bowling alley menu? I mean, if it gets hacked, so what? You put it back up. I mean, you don't want to spend tons of money protecting the menu of the bowling alley, the same as you did as employee records or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of inherent security built into things, but there's a lot of inherent insecurity, and you really just need somebody to say what are the risks you're willing to take and how to minimize that. So that's really the role of security expert. The other thing is really there's a potential to actually record respect or trust. You can actually do respect points. That's something with Dan Larimer's Fractally that people can see by going to fractally.com or gofractally.com is this idea of trust. But the problem is you don't want groupthink trust, where somebody decides, like you take either of our political parties in the United States and they're assigning trust to each other left, right. That's not very valid of trust. The key to trust is to get rid of groupthink by having people evaluated over time for that, as David said, for the avatar they are. So you have to be very clear. I mean, as the administrator for banking and the stuff like LD2 is doing, that's different than does the, what's he like, if you go party with him. Could be great, could be real trust in both of them. The point is, they could be really different either way. And so you need to apply those trust points. So the metaverse allows you to put those trust points and attach it to people over time and vary it. So you can walk around with the trust for the different role that you are. And that trust can even be shared between different groups. So there can be an exchange of trust. But the big thing you don't want is groupthink. You need to randomize the auditing. So like Extra was talking about, you need to randomize the auditing, because if the auditors have a set interest in trying to push the results one way, that's not good either. So you don't want this internal control to form an entity of its own. The best thing to do, when I did a lot of government work, that's what they used to do. They used to break it up, and you got called. Something like jury duty. Sorry, you're that. So you didn't get anybody, especially when we're talking about security, things like then was called, cybersecurity, cryptologic security, things like that. They purposely made sure that a group of people didn't get control by mixing it up and rotating people and calling it random. And so you can actually do that. Fractally does a lot of that, where you randomize the assignment of trust and having different people look at you, and because it's a metaverse and the blockchain, those follow you, and they go up and down, and they can be traded. The only thing I'm interested in is like David Smith talked about, when he becomes a digital human too, and I sign a level of trust to the digital version of David Smith, um, is that digital version going to act a certain way? Is if I can rent the digital version, does that get the same amount of trust that he has? That's food for thought.
Well, I think on that point, Eric, I think that it's really your point about David Smith avatar that you're describing kind of like dovetails with Dwayne is saying, right? Which is that community exists, right? But how manipulatable is that community, right? How manipulatable is that David Smith avatar in that community, right? Can I take over, or can some nefarious actor or bad actor take over the David Smith avatar, right? And now I'm able to manipulate the community in a way that is an advantage to me because he has that kind of hierarchy or that status within the community, right? And how do you protect about those sort of things? The same way to your point about how do you protect against the quote unquote authority or objectivity that the auditor has, in our example, right? So those become another kind of like level of trust. It's not just Dwayne's point about the community, but are you manipulating the community, right? Or are you manipulating the avatars in that community, right? I mean, where does that level end, right? How far down the onion do you need to go? How many layers do you need to take before you say, oh, now I really can trust that person?
I don't know.
And I know they're not being manipulated, and I know that Dr. Sharif has to go. So anyway, I'll leave it.
I think randomization, and some people call sortocracies, has a role of that, because we see what happens in our government when you let somebody be a politician for 30, 40 years and they're in their 70s and 80s. We've seen what happens that way. So the idea of saying, no, you get to pick candidates, but you don't get to pick who wins. You just have to say these are certified. Anyway, I turn that over for David for his thoughts.
Well, I love y'all talking about my avatar. And I'm going to take Dwayne's approach, and I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of forks in the code on my avatar. And, I'm going to make one of those forks Brazilian, so that I can go down, since Carnival's coming up, and I'm going to put a natural language processor on it so that my English comes out as Portuguese. And, who knows, maybe with my Brazilian avatar, Virginia and I might end up dancing at Carnival. Who knows? But that actually example points to some of the problems with trust in the metaverse. Because the metaverse has to respect trademarks. It has to respect patents. It has to respect property rights. And it has to respect that intellectual property. And the more I begin to do it, fork after fork after fork, the intellectual property becomes cloudy in what you can do with it there and where it can go. And I'm going to be short on the conclusion. We've talked about a lot of the things, but the rules of the metaverse are being written today by its early adopters, and really not the broad cohesiveness you see. The Metaverse Forum is beginning to have some impact, but it's the early adopters, and it threatens to exclude some of the key voices in the industry, in the ecosystem, as you see what they're doing today. And that's some of the challenges we saw when we were setting standards, like in the ISO community, in the semiconductor community, and others, is the role of those early adopters. And, other people besides the tech developers, some of the government entities have a role. These include financial, mental health professionals. I think mental health, as I said earlier, is going to be a really big problem in the metaverse. Sustainable experts, civil rights activists, others like that have to have a place. And they have an important role in studying the regulatory mechanisms, the government mechanisms, the ways the different countries implement their standing laws of commerce. do the standing laws of commerce work in the metaverse? I would tend to say no. We begin to see those in how we put them together. But to me, the metaverse is going to help us continue to expand how we're interconnected, how we're digital. And as you've heard me say many times, the fact that increasingly everything in the world's digital and everything in the world is connected, the metaverse is really a natural extension of that. But again, every element needs to be considered from the different angles: the regulatory, legal, commercial, user, health, all of those things in it, because the metaverse will likely grow in a Wild West fashion until these different entities catch up and begin to look at it comprehensive, to standards emerge, to regulatory frameworks emerge, to nations begin to say, we need to govern this in a connected way, in a way that's in sync across us. Because if 192 nations have different laws and regulations that affect the metaverse, God, that's going to be hard to manage and hard to put the places together. So, if I'm, Shrifi, often ask the question about the impact in Malaysia. I would look at how to take small steps right now. In the government institution, the universities, in the entrepreneur community, this is something you're not going to be able to ignore. You're going to have to address it. You're going to have to learn from it. You're going to have to move forward with it. And, you should take small steps to pinpoint where the greatest return on your investment you're going to have. And building trust in the metaverse is one of the key foundations to having any type of return on investment from what is done in the metaverse. So, Sharif, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was just going to follow up really quickly, David. That was excellent. And I think right now, I would invite all the early adopters that are passionate about trust to join our governance experiment, because we have a lot of passionate people every week trying to discover and solve this big issue. And we feel that it comes down to governance. And the interesting thing as an early adopter, that this is not just a voluntary position, that you're rewarded for your thoughts and your opinions on which steps we can take to build a community that is building trust with each other. So I would urge you to look at Go Fractally. We have some thought leaders that have tackled this tough issue for the last 10 years. So this has been an iteration year after year to try and solve this. And we're not there. This is still an ongoing discussion. But I really believe that even if we had the best code and it was distributed, we still need this human factor to come to consensus, like Extra said, so that it's not manipulated, so that we can have some foundation to this level of trust.
Thank you. This is really great discussion, especially those who want to learn more about metaverse. In Malaysia, we have our academy. We are developing Metaverse Academy, and hopefully, we get more of the guideline from our North American friends, and we will work together. So that is the way we enhance the capacity of local ecosystem, and especially for the youth communities. And these youth communities will help us to grow our economy in a sustainable way. That is our objective of World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you, Professor Eric and Professor David Smith, and all of our friends, those who join in World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Thank you.